I know, I'm trying to decide. I would love to do hair like once in my life because it's so straight. Like, it's just straight all the time. But it's just not going to work there. I'm going to need it. I'm never going to be able to get rid of it.
Okay, so we started grading the exams. Didn't get started till this weekend. Looking good so far. We hope to have them done this week. Maybe Wednesday. More realistic is we'll be back Friday. But since 61 of you did it electronically, it'll be back in your Dropbox when we're done grading it, so you can see it. If you did it by hand, it's almost certainly going to be a return date after spring break, because this is our last few classes before spring break, and we start up a new unit today. The kind of centerpiece of this class, an art unit. And we begin in a city that I know very well, Padua. We begin in the Trecento, the 1300s. We're going to look at Giotto, and we're going to look at the much less well-known artist who is really his heir in many ways in the city of Padua, a guy named Giusto de Menavoia. We're going to look at two major pieces of fresco painting, the Scrovegni Chapel and the Baptistry next to the cathedral. Wednesday's a discussion day. We have two chapters from books, one by Michael Baxendall, the other by Bruce Cole, both of which are about more the mechanics of painting. How did these artists actually go about mixing their colors, preparing their surfaces, the nuts and bolts of painting as opposed to the finished product. So that's a discussion day. Then when we come back from spring break, we'll have some lecture days, one on architecture, looking at the two great revivers of Roman architectural style, Filippo Brunelleschi in Florence and Andrea Palladio up in the Veneto. Then we'll have another lecture day on the true really embodiment of the Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. Talk about him more in terms of his anatomical experiments and dissections, of which he does hundreds, and his notebooks. Because he really only does a handful of pieces of art, most notably the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper in Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. Then we'll have another lecture day on his great near contemporary, and in many ways his rival, fellow Florentine Michelangelo Buonarroti, but a very different childhood from Leonardo. Leonardo doesn't even have a last name. Da Vinci's not a last name. It simply means from Vinci. It's this little tiny town outside of Florence. Michelangelo, on the other hand, in his teenage years, lives with the Medici family in great splendor in their palace. Very different formative years. And then we'll have 3 discussion days in a row. One on one particular piece of Michelangelo's art, a short article by Shrimplin on his last great masterpiece, the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel, where right now the cardinals are beginning to gather for the conclave to choose the next pope, his painting of the Last Judgment, and then our first book for this class. We'll do this in 2 days. Richard Goldthwait's Wealth and Demand for Art. So if you haven't gotten it yet, you need to be ordering that post-haste. It is in the bookstore, but I assume the bookstore price is much more expensive than you can get it through the link on the website. We'll spend 2 days reading this book about the market for art. So in some ways we're talking about the art itself in this unit, but also how it's actually produced and the patrons and the people who actually pay for it, something that Richard Goldthwait will talk extensively about. So we've got 3 discussion days, Artisans and Artists, Last Judgment, and then 2 for Goldthwait's book on Wealth and Demand for Art. Then we'll have a review day, and we'll have a second exam, same format as the first. 1 question drawn from the secondary source readings, the other question drawn from the more primary source narrative component. So, that is the next few weeks. I like this lecture. I like Giotto, and I like Padua. It's one of my favorite lectures of the semester. And in it, we set up a contrast. Art for centuries in Europe is fairly static. We have 3 pieces of art here. 1, a mosaic from the 6th century. 1, a tapestry, the Bayeux Tapestry, from the 11th century. And 1, a panel painting from the early 13th century. Not a lot of differences between them. They're very two-dimensional, very static, not what we would call very realistic or naturalistic. Things begin to change, though, in Italy, the end of the 1200s, with 2 Florentine artists. A man born into a very medieval world, Cimabue, born in the middle of the 1200s, 75 years after the Battle of Legnano. This is one of his altarpieces. Still very medieval, very iconographical, very flat, but beginning to be more naturalistic. And his great student, fellow Florentine by the name of Giotto, will begin to paint in a much more realistic, naturalistic fashion. Vasari said of Giotto when Cimabue found him, Giotto was a young boy in the countryside, and he was able to draw a perfect circle with a stick in the dirt, showing his preternatural abilities. And these 2 men, master and apprentice, are given a great contract at the end of the 1200s, when Giotto is still a young man and Cimabue is nearing the end of his life. And it's in a city that's very small, down here in Umbria, to the southeast of Florence, a city called Assisi. And this city has risen to prominence in the 1200s because of an inhabitant, a man who had lived there. It's not a big town. Here are the satellite imagery. You can see it's a hill town like Siena, along the spine of these Umbrian hills. And in it there's a huge basilica. Here it is from the air. It's a basilica built in honor of one of the residents of the city, Francesco, Saint Francis. Francesco, or Francis, had been the son of a very wealthy merchant in Assisi, but in the early 1200s he had a kind of crisis of conscience and came to believe that wealth was the enemy of salvation. That to be truly Christian, you had to imitate Jesus and the apostles. And Jesus and the apostles didn't own property. They were very poor. They begged for their food and meals and lodging. And so he gave away everything he had and began to gather around him followers, not unlike Jesus in the New Testament. And he starts a whole new monastic order, the Franciscans, who shun property, who embrace poverty, and who famously will wear very plain brown cloaks with ropes for belts, imitating the poverty of the apostles. But because of their holiness, they quickly attract donations. And by even the 1230s, just a decade after Francis dies, money begins to pour in because people believe these guys are truly close to God. And so if they pray for me, then God will certainly hear their prayers. And so construction has begun on this huge basilica in St. Francis's honor. And the interior is anything but humble. Decorated from the floor to the vaults by Cimabue and Giotto. Now, I spent my junior year abroad. It was 1997. Many of you were like 4. Horrifying. And some were in their late 30s. And I'd only been there about a month. When on the 26th of September, an earthquake struck. Italy is in a not inactive seismic region. There's the apse of the basilica coming down. Especially when you get down towards Sicily, there's a fair number. There's volcanoes in Sicily that are active, and Italy from time to time has earthquakes on the scale of 5 to 6 on the Richter scale, like this one, and it collapsed the vault in the Basilica of St. Francis, the 900-year-old or 700-year-old basilica. And one thing Italians are really good at is restoring things. And so they picked up all the pieces of the frescoes, little tiny shards, and they put them all back together again. It took a long time. You can see this conservator here with a fresco of St. Francis with all these little pieces that have been picked up. Massive jigsaw puzzle. But they put the pieces back together again. Now, as you can see, there are people underneath this, this vault when it collapsed, and several people did, in fact, die in the church because this is an aftershock. There had been an earthquake in the morning and the ceiling had cracked. And so there were people in there surveying the damage, engineers, when the second earthquake struck and catastrophe ensued. But they put it all back together again. If you go there now, you won't know that 15 years ago it collapsed. So what do Giotto and Cimabue paint? Well, they paint the story of the life of Francis. They paint his renunciation of worldly goods. Here is Francis's father having to be held back as Francis famously, in the main square in Assisi, takes off all his clothes and declares that he shall follow only the Holy Spirit, and he's looking up to the hand of God poking out from the sky there, with the bishop looking a bit embarrassed for Francis, turning his head and covering him with a cloak. But what you see here is a burgeoning style. This doesn't look medieval. There's some three-dimensionality to it. There's some attempts back here at depth. Granted, it's very ham-fisted. But there's an attempt here to paint depth into the painting, to use perspective. Something that will be really a hallmark of Florentine painting in the 1400s, has its roots here at the end of the 1200s in Assisi. There's a famous episode in Francis's life where he is so captivating of a preacher that the animals come to listen to him. A kind of allusion to the animals present at the nativity of Jesus bowing their heads in honor of the newborn king. And so here is Francis preaching to the birds in his very plain brown cloak. Francis is also one of the first of many saints who will claim that they have received the wounds of Jesus, known as the stigmata, on the wrists, on the ankles, and in the rib cage. It's a mark of holiness. And here is Francis, an archangel, and lines going to his wrists, to his ankles, and to his side. And again, you get a sense of depth here in this fresco. Better perspective with this little hut. Not sure what it's exactly supposed to be. Possibly a meditation cell for Francis. And some nice detail and shading on the rocks back here. A style is evolving here at the end of the 1200s. Yes, Don?
From what vantage point do we look at this? I'm wondering if we were standing down and up high, if that would enhance the sense of perspective.
I don't know where this is on the wall. It is on the wall in the apse. How far up it is, I do not know. John, look it up. Good question. One kind of common aspect of medieval painting is there's not a lot of emotion in it. But here in the death scene of Francis, there is emotion. And the expression of emotion will be one of the differentiating factors, one of the hallmarks of what we call Renaissance painting in the 1300s, especially in the 1400s and 1500s, in a sense culminating with Michelangelo's Last Judgment that we'll look at later after spring break. Here is Francis, lying prone here, with his disciples around him, mourning. And if we look at this in detail, you get a real pathos here, especially this follower crying on his feet. You get some innovative angles. You see people's back. People are turned away from the viewer. Medieval art is characteristically everybody's looking straight out at you, absolutely perpendicular, because that's the easiest way to do it in some respects. You see people in this three-dimensional gathering here around the dead St. Francis. 10 years later, construction will begin on this massive basilica, and at the end of the 1200s, Giotto and Cimabue will be brought in to decorate it. So this is all happening down in Assisi. Way down here, rather isolated town in Umbria. This project will bring Giotto to the notice of someone way up in the north. Right up there. The city of Padua. It's a city where I spent my Fulbright years. It's a city I go back to for about a month every summer or Christmas break. I highly recommend it, though don't tell anybody about it because I don't want to see a lot of American tourists there, please. These are the old medieval walls, which no longer exist but are still very apparent in the topography of the city, and that's where my wife and I had our apartment, just outside of the walls. There's the Palazzo della Regione, the city hall for the Republic. Florence, or Padua, is a republic during the 1100s and 1200s. It's only in the 1300s that it'll come under the sway of a single family, the Carrara family. But we're first going to look at something outside of the walls. Way up here. Right up here. It's a park today. But it used to be the site of a Roman arena. Because this was a Roman town, Patavium. It was a Roman colony back in the Republican Empire. And, like every good Roman colony, you had to have an arena because you had to have a place for the gladiators to kill each other and to kill wild animals and prisoners. But you had to have a place for the ultra-violence, as Malcolm McDowell would say, from A Clockwork Orange. There's not much left of the arena. This is the arena in Verona. It's very well preserved, and if you go there today during the summer, you can see operas performed in the arena. It's terribly civilized. This is about all that's left of the Paduan arena. There was more of it once upon a time, because it's here that a chapel is built. Looks like this today. It sits in the middle of what feels like a park, but it didn't used to be a park. Because when this chapel is built, it's actually part of a palace complex built into the old structure of the Roman arena. This happened in a lot of Italian towns. In the town of Lucca, for example, people build into the arena because it's already there, and you just have to kind of put up some walls here and there to make it into a home. And it's also good from a fortified defensive standpoint. This happens in Lucca. This happens in a whole host of cities up and down the Italian peninsula that were Roman colonies. Happens here. So here is the chapel we are concerned with, originally attached to this palace. It's a family chapel. It's called the Scrovegni Chapel because it's paid for by the Scrovegni family, who live in the ruins of that arena, and who build this chapel for the extirpation of their sins. We'll talk a little bit about what those sins are. And Giotto is brought in a couple of years, after he's done down in Assisi to paint the inside. And Enrico Scrovegni, who is the guy who's paying for all this, wants him to execute a very ambitious fresco site. Sir?
Well, it looks like, the closest I could find is that it looks like the stigmata is on the second level in the church. There's
About 10 feet up.
Yeah, there's one layer, and it's the second level up.
Okay. There you go, John.
Well, that wasn't the one we're looking at, the perspective. It was the one where you saw...
Renunciation of worldly goods?
No, he was out on the mountains. There were two little huts on either side.
Well, that's a stigmata.
Is that the stigmata?
Look see where the renunciation is. Not that I think it matters, because I think Giotto really screwed up the perspective, no matter if that thing was 50 feet in the air at eye level. So the walls here are completely frescoed with the lives of 3 generations. Joachim, who doesn't actually appear in the main text of the Bible, but appears in apocryphal books of the Bible. He's the father of Mary. Joachim and Anne, the parents of Mary. Mary, of course, the mother of Jesus, and then the life of Jesus. So you have 3 generations of a family here, with the story of Joachim and Anne and Mary in the top register, and the story of Jesus here in the main frames along the sides. And to kind of introduce this landmark piece of art, I'm going to turn it over to an English art historian by the name of Andrew Graham Dixon. Very charismatic. He's been doing documentaries on art for 15 years now. He's also very well published in art. He wrote a great biography of Caravaggio. This was published recently and reviewed somewhat favorably, somewhat unfavorably in the New York Review of Books a couple months ago. So, Andrew Graham Dixon, take it away.
Padua, like Pisa, has its classical survivals. The Arena Chapel owes its name to the fact that it was built on the site of a Roman arena. Since 1313, it's been the location of a very different kind of spectacle.
Sometimes this is also called the Arena Chapel because it was built into the walls of this arena. It's also known as the Scrovegni Chapel. It's a little more logical name because it's the Scrovegni family that pays for it. So you'll hear both Arena Chapel and Scrovegni Chapel, same place.
When you walk in, you immediately become part of a piece of total theatre. Overwhelmed, you have no choice but to respond to the way Giotto's transformed every inch of the space. This great masterpiece of early 14th century painting is a series of frescoes in which he depicted scenes from the life of the Virgin and of Christ. Giotto's paintings were commissioned by Enrico Scrovegni, whose tomb, complete with his effigy, is behind the altar. The chapel was built to expiate the sins of his father, a moneylender or usurer. Usury was regarded as a particularly repugnant sin, on a par with fornication and prostitution. It was money being created by illicit means, dirty currency, like bastard children being generated out of lawful wedlock. The chapel also contains several sculptures by Giovanni Pisano, and statues such as this had a great influence on Giotto. The painter's style is itself sculptural. There's a tremendous sense of weight and mass about his figures. They could almost be sculptures that have come to life. The story of Christ's Passion unfolds from one tableau to the next, very much like scenes in a play or frames in a film. I think Giotto must have been influenced by miracle plays and the sacred theatre of his time. The lamentation over the dead Christ is one of the most powerful of all the images in the chapel. Giotto's paintings are usually full of uprights and verticals, but here everything is focused on Christ's dead body, which gives the picture a horizontal emphasis that sets it apart from all the others. It's as if Giotto's own art has been brought to its knees, bent out of true by the tragedy of Christ's death. Because Giotto's figures are so heavy and monumental, there's something shocking about seeing them show emotion. It's like seeing a statue cry, tears pouring down a stone face. The artist puts so much feeling into the mourners that they seem, disturbingly, full of an inner life. By giving his figures such psychological depth, Giotto elicits an emotional response from us, the recognition of fellow feeling.
I think that empathy is the key to the Arena Chapel and to Giotto. The figures in his paintings react to tragic events with extreme emotion, but their grieving is also like a form of spiritual contemplation. They're part of the scene, but they're also like a congregation of people in church who've been deeply moved by a powerful image of Christ. By giving them this quality of contemplation, Giotto made space for us to inhabit his pictures. It's as if the people in his paintings are responding on our behalf, showing us how to react and allowing us in.
Now you notice in this image here on the left, the frescoes are not in very good shape. A huge restoration project was undertaken from the late 90s onward. It started just after he was there. It took about 10 years. And if you go there today, you have to spend about 20 or 30 minutes in a kind of dehumidifying chamber before you're allowed into this virtually hermetically sealed chapel. You can only stay for 15 minutes before they kick you out. It costs about $1.50 a minute to be in there. It used to be free and open. Now that's no longer the case. But it has effectively preserved these frescoes. So let's start with the beginning. 3 generations of Jesus' family. First with his grandparents, Joachim and Anne. Don't actually appear in the official Bible, appear in the apocryphal books. And it's interesting that they get included here because often they don't get included. The story begins with John the Baptist and Elizabeth and Mary and Jesus. But Joachim and Anne are pictured here at a very Renaissance wedding ceremony. One kind of hallmark of Renaissance art is that whatever the time period, be it 1st century Galilee, be it 3rd century Rome, everybody looks contemporary. They're wearing the clothing of turn of the 14th century Paduans. The soldiers are Swiss Landsknechte instead of Roman legionnaires. There's really a lack of understanding that maybe people 1,300 years ago did not dress like me. It's an interesting attribute that we'll see over and over again in Renaissance art. It's very ahistorical when it comes to fashion and military attire. So here we are at a nice turn of the 14th century wedding with Joachim and Anne. A scene that's replicated in many ways with the marriage of their daughter, the already visibly pregnant, holding her stomach there, Mary and Joseph. And one thing that I find is mildly amusing about the depiction of Joseph and Joachim is just how much they look alike. I say women want to marry their fathers, but Mary actually pulled that off here in her own marriage to Joseph. The child will come, child born in Bethlehem in a manger with Joseph seemingly checked out. Throughout much of Christian history, Joseph is a very minor character. It's really not until the 16th and 17th century that he's kind of rehabilitated and often made younger. He's kind of depicted as a doddering accessory throughout much of Christian history, and here he is dozing while Mary is with the baby. Now you'll notice here, a lot of the paint looks like it's in very good condition, but Mary's cloak here is a mess. That's because of the nature of frescoing. Fresco literally means fresh in Italian, or cool, another term. Mainly fresh. And that's because you paint on wet plaster. And the paint soaks into the plaster and is embedded into the wall. Meaning you can take a sponge and water and clean a fresco and you don't affect the paint. However, this blue paint is made from a precious, not semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli, which comes from modern-day Turkey. It's very deep cobalt blue. And the color that you get from grinding up these stones is called ultramarine. And it's extraordinarily expensive. It's the most expensive paint you can buy. And because of this, Mary is always depicted wearing blue. Not because in 1st century Judea she was always wearing blue, but because it's the most expensive paint. If red was the most expensive paint you could buy, Mary would always be wearing red. But artists oftentimes had to pay for everything up front, all their materials, and then got reimbursed when the project was done. This is true even for Michelangelo working on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the early 1500s. And so what undoubtedly happened here was Giotto couldn't afford the lapis lazuli ultramarine paint. And he added it after the fact. Once he got paid, once Enrico Scrovegni opened up the purse strings, he was able to add this ultramarine paint. But because he was painting on the surface of the wall that was dry, it flakes off, as is happening right here, and is happening in the sky. There's scenes then of Jesus' life, his childhood, the presentation of the temple, the disputation with the doctors of theology. We're going to fast forward to the end of his life, the entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Again, Jesus originally painted with a yellow cloak on which the ultramarine paint is added after the fact, most of which has simply flaked off in the intervening 7 centuries. in Jerusalem. Jesus' life comes to an end. One of his last acts is to have a Last Supper, the Cenaculo, with his disciples. This is the really kind of typical medieval depiction, which is very realistic, with people around a table. So we're going to see with Giusto di Menaboi, he chooses to have everyone facing the audience, to have that fourth wall be in effect. You also notice the halos are all black except for Jesus. This is not because the disciples are all evil, but rather because Jesus' halo is made from a higher quality gold leaf. It is actually very thinly hammered out gold that's applied to the wall. And the higher quality gold, the more pure it is, the less it will diminish and tarnish. The halos of the disciples, made of much less pure gold, has tarnished badly in the intervening 7 centuries. There's Judas looking quite mean, ready to betray. And here is the image of Judas selling out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, as related in the Gospels, with this very nice demon over his shoulder receiving the sack of silver from the Pharisees, the temple. Then the climactic scene of the whole story, in the Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal by a kiss, with this tumult around these two central figures here of Judas and Jesus, a very serene Jesus, a very angry Peter, who famously in one of the gospel accounts cuts the ear off of a Roman soldier, and you can actually see the ear dropping from this guy's head, and the Roman soldiers, quote unquote, looking very much like Swiss mercenaries, which are the soldiers of choice here in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And if we look at a detail of this painting, one thing that Giotto does differently is differentiation. There's not a type of person, there's lots of different people here. If we look at something like the mosaics in San Vitale of Justinian from the 500s, everybody kind of looks the same. Here we get very different faces with very different expressions, and then there goes the ear of that poor Roman there with Judas and Jesus right here in the middle. A betrayal that will lead to a crucifixion with a background that was entirely painted of lapis lazuli paint. And for the medieval eye, this is a kind of marker of its importance. This panel costs more than any other panel to paint because it's full of ultramarine paint, from Mary's cloak here to the entire background around the crucifixion. Mary Magdalene, their long red hair, I should say, not orange hair, red hair there at the base of the crucifix, and then a scene reminiscent of what he had painted for the Franciscans down in Assisi, the deposition of the dead Jesus. And they're remarkably similar scenes, Jesus, Francis, and you can see in a sense his development. This is done probably a decade or so after this. He's matured. He's gotten better, quite frankly. There's much more movement here in this image, in this horizontally arranged image, than you have up here from the late 1200s to around maybe 1310 or 1311. Much more color, much more detail in the drapery here, in the clothing of the women, and also in the emotional expressions. He's developing as an artist. So this story of Joachim, Anne, and Jesus are on the walls of this chapel. From Joachim and Anne and Mary at the top to Jesus then on the lower registers. And actually at the very bottom of the walls, there are depictions of the vices and the virtues, much like are painted by Lorenzetti in Siena some years later. So that's the walls. On the west wall, on the wall that is the one that you walk through to get into the chapel, it's something that I find much more interesting than this rather formulaic story of the 3 generations of Jesus' family. Here's the entrance, so you'd walk in here, and the altar would be over where the windows are in this room. It's a last judgment, an apocalypse, with this massive sized Jesus in the middle, to his right the saved, to his left the damned being taken into hell. And here is hell. He is producing this at virtually the same time that Dante is writing the Divine Comedy, is writing the Inferno. Dante is actually in Padua writing the Inferno at the time that Giotto is painting this. Given the depictions in here, they almost certainly had some kind of contact. 2 foreign artists, 2 Florentine artists in this foreign Paduan land. Dante wrote about Lucifer, Satan, as having 3 mouths in which Judas, Cassius, and Brutus are being perpetually eaten. This demon has certainly one mouth here. You can see an ass and legs hanging out, Judas. But then there's serpents coming out from the sides. So kind of like what Dante is writing, but not entirely. But the punishments here are very Dante-esque. People are being physically punished, which is what happened to the sinners in Dante's version of hell. What you do in this life will be brought upon you in death. It's a very corporeal hell. And keep this in mind when we get to Michelangelo's Last Judgment. It's a very psychological interpretation of what hell is. It's the absence of God. For Dante and for Giotto here, hell is physical punishments. Your sins in life will be reflected for all eternity in hell. For Dante, the usurers, the people who used money to make money, who lent money at interest, their punishment is to have molten gold and silver poured down their throats for all eternity. Just like is happening there. The blasphemers are strung up by their tongues, just like this guy here, which is probably a better fate than these 2 guys, which are being hung by their penises. It would be an exceedingly painful way to go through eternity, but let's be honest, it'd probably give way fairly quickly. So what you have here is it's very Dante-esque. And you can chicken or the egg this. Did Dante devise these punishments in his Inferno because he saw Giotto painting this? Or did Giotto paint these corporeal punishments because he read Dante? Question.
The demon that's pouring, is that supposed to be gold being poured in her mouth and it's flaked off like the halos?
It looks like it's probably supposed to be silver because it is silvery. And then this person is being roasted on the spit. Something very untoward is happening here. Scholars do not know. We don't have definitive dates for when he actually paints this. We know he works on this chapel for almost a decade. But when he paints what, we don't know. And we also don't know exactly when Dante's writing. Yes?
Are some of his punishments in reference to Rome?
Reference to what?
In reference to Roman Empire. Some of these punishments happened during that time frame as well.
Well, Dante is very much a classicist. Some people have argued that his understanding of Satan is a kind of reference to Minos. He is very consciously, a lot of what he writes in the Divine Comedy is meant to say, hey, look at all the classical authors I've read. After all, who was his guide in the Inferno? Virgil, the great Roman poet. You start to get into influences and impacts and all of that. It all mixes together here. Question, Don.
On the other side of the painting, if you could bring up the whole painting again, over on the left-hand side, it looks like he does have historical figures down.
Well, this is an interesting little vignette here. This is supposed to probably be a bishop who has a man kneeling in front of him with a bag of gold, trying to buy his salvation.
Okay.
And the joke is, well, the bishop's in hell too.
And is that Judas in the hanging up above him?
I would assume this is supposed to be Judas here, because that's where Dante places Judas. He gives Satan 3 mouths with Brutus and Cassius on the side mouths because they are regicides. Dante was very much a monarchist. And Judas, the arch betrayer, there in the middle mouth. This person's been disavowed. Here are more people being strung up. It's a very nasty place, and we'll juxtapose this hell with Michelangelo's hell, painted in the 1530s in the Sistine Chapel. A very different interpretation of what hell is. Now, also on this wall is an image of Enrico Scrovegni himself, the son of the moneylender, the son of the usurer, and this nice little model he is presenting to what scholars have argued are a classical or classicizing reference to the 3 graces. There are classical allusions all throughout this, and there are in Dante, there is here in Giotto, in this church being supported by a monk. And this scene is right here. And consciously, Enrico Scrovegni is on the right side of the equation. People to the right side of Jesus are saved, and here you have people actually being pulled out of their tombs and being brought up towards Jesus and the saints. There's Peter to his right side. Here is his crucifix, kind of denoting the quick and the dead, the saved and the damned. And then here is this great image of hell. And so as you're leaving this chapel, the last thing you see is remember who paid for it, Enrico Scrovegni, but also the punishments of hell. And to give you a sense of scale, this door is about as wide as this screen, probably a good 8 feet across, and it's probably about 7 feet high. So all of this would be kind of up where the gray is, very, very visible and very vivid when it's first painted. It's certainly, as you can see up here, we've lost large sections of the plaster, and so we've lost the actual painting, but thankfully hell survived fairly intact. And if we look at Dante's hierarchy of sin, we've already looked at this in regards to the sowers of discord who are all the way down here near Satan. The crimes of Enrico's father named Reginaldo, are counted by Dante. In fact, there's a scene in the Inferno where Dante meets Reginaldo Scrovegni. He doesn't refer to him by name, but he refers to him by the coat of arms of the family. They're pretty far down there. They're in the 7th circle. Violence against one's neighbor, using money to make money, is a crime. It's prohibited because you're not actually producing anything. So, Dante, Giotto, Dante, chicken or the egg? We don't really know because we don't know the exact dates. When he's actually painting that Last Judgment and when Dante's actually writing the Inferno. We have a range, 13 teams. Certainly, though, I think they had contact because they're both Florentines. And they're both strangers in this Paduan land. So the Scrovegni Chapel's up here. We're going to go down here to a much less famous piece of art, but I think in many ways better. It's in the baptistry. This is the very plain cathedral, the city of Padua, and next to it is the baptistry, sponsored by the lord of the city, the despot whose family had taken over the republic in the 1330s, the Carrara family, Francesco da Carrara, who rules the city in the second half of the 1300s. And it will be he and his family that will build this baptistry and commission this Florentine, although Vasari thought he was Paduan, he's actually Florentine. Giusto de Menoboy, who is born around the year 1320 to paint the inside, in imitation, in many ways, of what Giotto had done earlier in the century for the Scrovegni family. It costs about $25 to get into the Scrovegni chapel. It costs about $2 to get into the baptistry. And you can stay as long as you want because it's not hermetically sealed and you don't have to go through a decompression chamber to get into it. But I think it's actually more impressive. Here's the baptismal font. Baptistry means a place where you do baptisms. And the walls are completely frescoed, as is the cupola, with not just the story of Jesus, but the entire Bible is here. From the creation right through to the apocalypse, to the end of the world. The Old Testament, the New Testament, the book of Revelation, it's all here. I think this is a more impressive work, Pace Giotto, than the Scrovegni Chapel. We get the story of Adam and Eve. Eve being created from Adam's rib as God, in the guise of Jesus, puts Adam to sleep. Adam and Eve in the garden. Adam and Eve being tempted. Adam and Eve being expelled. The children of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, coming to blows here. Here's Cain ready to brain Abel with a large club. And we see the kind of fall of man. The cataclysm of the flood. A very literal interpretation using the Old Testament for what the ark would have looked like. The dimensions basically give you a big, tall building. And so here you have Noah building the ark, the flood with everybody dying, and Noah and his family being saved, with the ark very precipitously perched between two mountains there. Thank God it stood upright. And then the Tower of Babel, the construction of this humanity-wide project to reach God. And so we have here rather dark scenes of the fall of man, from the expulsion from the garden here by the archangel Michael to the construction of the Tower of Babel. And I like this guy falling. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. We also get the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, looking very much like Lorenzetti's depictions of Siena. Renaissance artists had no conception that things used to look different. Or if they did, they didn't care. And so Sodom and Gomorrah look very much like a 14th century Italian city, with a nice loggia here and towers. But they, of course, are doomed. So you've got around the drum of the dome the story of the Old Testament, which kind of prefaces then what happens in the New Testament. Specifically what happens with John the Baptist and Jesus. And so you get the birth of John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus here by John the Baptist with God and the Holy Spirit descending onto Jesus in the Jordan River, and then some very badly damaged because of humidity, because this is not climate controlled. It's open to the elements for all intents and purposes. There's just a wooden door that doesn't close very well. You have the execution of John the Baptist. As the story goes in the New Testament, John the Baptist is a prisoner of Herod. And Herod's daughter, Salome, pictured there, does a very sexy dance for her father. And Herod says, it's fantastic, Salome. What do you want? Name your price. That was a great dance, daughter. And she says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. Done and done. And unfortunately, heavily damaged here. We can't really see the moment of the execution, but we can clearly see Salome dressed as a 14th century Paduan noblewoman. Then the story shifts to Jesus, as it had done in the Scrovegni chapel. Better preserved are some of these frescoes. Here is the Annunciation, the Archangel Gabriel telling Mary in an ultramarine robe that she will bear the Son of God, the Word being depicted by the dove here. An immaculate conception that will lead to the Nativity, again with a very disinterested, seemingly bored Joseph and Mary in her ultramarine gown, and the animals coming to pay homage to the newborn king, as the phrase goes. We get the arrival of the three kings from the east, the three magi, and early Renaissance depictions of the baby Jesus show him as just a tiny human. He's not a baby. If you look closely at this, it just looks like a shrunken person. It's not until you really get to the 1500s and 1600s that you get an infant Jesus. It's a very different understanding of how you represent Jesus here in the 1300s and 1400s versus the 1500s and the 1600s. The story moves forward. The calling of the disciples. Here, the calling of the fishermen out on the water to come and follow Jesus, dressed in a ultramarine blue robe, so we know he's an important guy, with a Renaissance city, medieval city, Italian city there in the background. We get, as we had with Giotto, the entry into Jerusalem. Unfortunately, because this one is closer to the floor, the frescoes closer to the floor level have gotten pretty badly damaged. As you can see here, we do have everybody in the trees, though, and Jesus with his still very intact golden halo riding into the city. Visit to the city that will not end well, that will culminate with a Last Supper here, and a rather innovative decision by Giusto de Menaboi to have everybody face the camera, so to speak, with one exception, Judas, whose back is turned to us, Thomas, the other 10 disciples, and then Judas, whose halo is intentionally black. A higher quality of gold here is used by the Carrara family for this fresco, this rather innovative, not often repeated kind of half-circle table that Giusto de Menaboi uses that I like quite a lot. And if we compare the two, admittedly, Giotto's a better artist. I'm not gonna argue that point. But I like the ambition of the baptistry. I also like that you can stay in there as long as you like, and you pay €2.50 for the privilege of getting in. After the Last Supper, the betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane, with Judas and his consciously black halo, and the Roman legionnaires, very much Swiss mercenaries here, as Renaissance artists are wont to do, and then Peter, in my favorite part of the scene, actually grabbing this guy by the hair and cutting his ear off with a dagger. particularly violent interpretation of that particular moment. And if we compare the two scenes, Giusto de Menavoy had, of course, been in the Scrovegni Chapel. It is rather early on recognized as a true masterpiece. An artist will visit it for inspiration, for style points. And you can see just how similar their depictions are, although Giusto has Judas on the left, probably a reference to the sinister, because in Italian, left is sinistra. We get the word sinister from it. Giotto has him on the right. But you get the same kind of verticality here with these pikes, and the pikes here as well. Similar depiction of the crucifixion. A lot more people present at Giusto's crucifixion than were present at Giotto's crucifixion, but you get the same use of ultramarine for the background, letting the viewer know, as if they didn't know already, that this is a very important scene. You get some nice detail here with... This guy has essentially a club, and he's hammering the nails into one of the two criminals next to Jesus, which is rather violent, but a nice touch, I think. And Mary down here, and we know it's Mary because she is wearing the blue cloak, denoting her as the mother of God. And, once again, Swiss mercenaries, supposed to be Roman legionnaires. And this is where Giotto leaves the story. He doesn't continue the story on, but Giusto de Menavoy does. Over the altar in the baptistry, he will depict the book of Revelation, the last book from the New Testament, which talks about the end of the world and the return of Jesus. An end of the world in which a seven-headed beast will torment humanity. Body of a cheetah, dragon's head with bishop's mitres on them. Because the book of Revelation says that the Antichrist will come and will deceive people into believing that he is a man of God. He also depicts in the four roundels around the altar in a kind of imitation of his depiction of the four evangelists around the four corners of the baptistry, the four horses of the apocalypse, drawn from Revelation chapter 6. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him. And he went forth conquering and to conquer. And there went out another horse that was red. The power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death. And hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. And finally, the image of a rather perturbed Jesus with a scythe, ready to end the world. And so in this one chapel, this one baptistry, I should say, you have the entire Bible. From the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve, Noah, Sodom and Gomorrah, right through to the New Testament, to John the Baptist, Jesus, the crucifixion and resurrection. And you have the end of the world over the altar. In the dome, you have heaven, with a massive image of Jesus at its center, surrounded by the company of saints above his mother, the Virgin Mary, which is right above the beginning of the whole story, the book of Genesis. It's a really well thought out baptistry. Now, this image of Jesus is a very common Byzantine depiction. It's a very old depiction. We call it the Pantocrator. Because when, I should tell you what that means, it means all conquering. Pan, all, krator, conquer, or power, all powerful. Democracy is the power of the demos, the people. When Constantine converted to Christianity, the Romans needed Jesus to be a kind of analog for the emperor, and the emperor to be an analog for Jesus. And so, for really the first 800-900 years or so of Christianity, the main depictions of Jesus are not as an infant and not on the cross, and certainly not as the dead Jesus, but rather as this very powerful imperial-like figure called the Pantocrator. It's from the Greek. And so we have in this baptistry, painted at the end of the 1300s, a in some ways very Renaissance naturalism, but from an iconographical standpoint, a very conservative Pantocrator Jesus. Finally, just as we had in the Scrovegni chapel, we have a depiction of the benefactor. Now, I'd said Francesco da Carrara had paid for this chapel, and he actually probably had paid for it. But he wasn't the main patron. He wasn't the guy who was wrangling Giusto de Menavoy. It was his wife. The great name, Fina Buzzaccarini, is her maiden name. Powerful family in Padua that married into the ruling Carrara family. And here she is being presented by John the Baptist to the Virgin Mary and Jesus. So just as Enrico Scrovegni had been presenting his gift, so too Fina Buzzaccarini is presenting her gift. And the meaning behind that is, I want spiritual points for this. This will help me to get to heaven. For Enrico Scrovegni, it was fear of the sin of usury. For Fina Buzzaccarini, if you're married to a despot like Francesco da Carrara, you have concerns about your family's immortal souls. And so, just the same, she is offering this baptistry as a gift to Jesus and the Virgin Mary in hopes that they will be kind when it comes to the last judgment. Okay, so that is the 1300s, the Trecento, as it's known in Italian, here in Padua, in two locations, the Scrovegni Chapel and the baptistry. Are there any questions? Well, as almost every baptistry, it's dedicated to John the Baptist. So sometimes it's called the Baptisterio di San Giovanni, but every baptistry is dedicated to John the Baptist because he's the baptism guy. Doesn't really happen under there. There's an altar. The altar's right there. You could say it right there. Not here. Well, sometimes you do it in the back. But it's primary function. Back to the thing. Okay, so we have a discussion day next time. Hang on, everybody. Hang on. Discussion day next time. They're chapters from books. One by Michael Baxendall from 1982, one from Bruce Cole from 1983, about the everything that went into this art. Because this art was not created in a vacuum, nor was it created without people paying for it. The Scrovegni Chapel exists because Enrico Scrovegni paid for it. It's not like Giotto went out and did this and then sold it to Enrico Scrovegni, and the same thing is true of the baptistry. Art had to have patrons. It's a very different world than today, where artists create something and then try and sell it. It was the exact opposite. You had to have somebody pay for it, then you created it, and that's how art was produced. So read Baxendale and Cole for Wednesday. Now you may leave.